Please note this podcast discusses real-life crimes and may include sensitive topics such as violence, abuse, and other disturbing content. We recommend listener discretion.
She was drugged up. They kept her in there. But he had to make sure she never left that room. They're ghastly details, but actually, is it better knowing them? Yeah, it is, because it's taken away some of the what happened, and it's given us answers.
I'm journalist Helen Fospero.
I'm crime reporter Martin Brunt.
And this is True Criminals.
A journey into the darkest corners of the criminal underworld, with insights from decades of true crime reporting.
The stories behind the stories, plus exclusive interviews with those closely involved in notorious cases.
Re-examining crimes so shocking, they still haunt our imaginations.
In this episode, a tragic story of mistaken identity, a cat and mouse game with kidnappers, a murder, and a family's resilience as they still search for the body of their loved one more than 50 years later. This is the story of Muriel McKay. We'll be talking to Muriel's grandson and asking what the case tells us about the traumatic legacy of murder for the victim's family. Martin, when did you first hear about this story?
I was a schoolboy, delivering newspapers morning and night in Ely in Cambridgeshire, where I grew up. And I distinctly remember every morning my bone shaker bicycle, the basket in front was loaded up with papers hot off the press, literally hot. They were still quite warm when we took them off the train from London. And there was one story around Christmas time that completely caught my imagination because it stared at me as I cycled the streets delivering these papers. And it was the story of the kidnap of Muriel McKay. And it was a story that went on and on and on. Every morning it seemed to be front page news, developments, the kind of cat and mouse game that the kidnappers were playing with the police, until eventually I read that the kidnappers had been arrested. But the question remained, what had happened to Muriel? And I do distinctly remember, and it was so chilling that it rather frightened the schoolboy in me. The rumour was that she had disappeared, she'd been killed, her body had been chopped up, and she had been fed to pigs on the farm in Hertfordshire, where the brothers had kept her and held her for ransom. Now, I was young, and that was a terrifying story to think about, particularly at that time of the year, Christmas and New Year, when everybody was having fun, having a great time. And there, every morning, staring out at me was this very grim story. And I do sometimes wonder whether, consciously or subconsciously, it began my interest in crime and being a journalist and wanting to cover stories like that. And, perhaps it was a catalyst for the career that I eventually adopted.
Maybe it was. I mean, working as a tea girl at a weekend when I was 14 at my dad's newspaper office certainly set me off on a journalistic career. So I would imagine that fascinating story in your bicycle basket probably did have some kind of influence. I heard about this story, bizarrely, from Rupert Murdoch's daughter, Liz, who was working as a runner in those days with you and I at Sky News, because, of course, the target of this kidnap was actually Liz's mum, Anna Murdoch, who at the time was married to Rupert. And Liz talked about life in the spotlight as a media mogul's daughter and the security fears she lived with. So I remember her actually recounting the story of how her mum had been targeted for a kidnap, but they'd taken the wrong woman. Who was Muriel McKay and what happened?
Muriel McKay was the wife of Alec McKay, and Alec McKay was the deputy to Rupert Murdoch. Murdoch had just arrived in London from Australia. He bought the News of the World and then he bought the Sun newspaper. He was very high profile. Everybody who read about him and saw him on TV knew that he was a very wealthy guy. And two of the people who read and watched him on TV were the Hussein brothers, Arthur and Nizamuddin. They were living in a ramshackle farm in Hertfordshire. And they came up with the idea to kidnap Rupert Murdoch's wife, Anna, Rupert's second wife. So they went to the headquarters of the Sun newspaper. They identified a Rolls-Royce with a chauffeur that was Rupert Murdoch's car. And they followed it one day to a house in Wimbledon and just assumed that that was where Rupert lived with his wife, Anna. Sometime later, they went back to the house, and when Muriel McKay turned up, they kidnapped her, thinking she was Anna Murdoch. They very soon quickly realised that they got it wrong. Now, why they made that mistake was that Rupert Murdoch had gone back to Australia at Christmas time and had lent his car to Alec McKay, his deputy, and of course Muriel was allowed to use it. So the brothers got the wrong woman. They quickly realised that they made that mistake, but carried on with their plot. So they took Muriel to the farm in Hertfordshire. They held her ransom there for a few days. They played a kind of cat and mouse game with Scotland Yard. They made a ransom demand. They wanted £1 million. They phoned the McKay family, talked to family members. Ian McKay, Muriel's son, was one of those who negotiated with the kidnappers. And at one point, £1 million, or what the brothers thought was £1 million, was put into a suitcase. It was a top layer of notes and newspaper underneath. This is just one example of the cat and mouse game that was played. The suitcase, by arrangement with the brothers, was left in a phone box in North London. Then the brothers phoned and said, no, we want to change the location. And the suitcase was moved a couple of times, ended up in a public phone box in Bishop Stortford. The brothers headed to the phone box to pick up what they thought was £1 million in the suitcase. Before they got there, a woman had walked in to make a phone call, spotted the suitcase, was suspicious, phoned Hertfordshire Police, the local constabulary. They sent a couple of officers to retrieve it. And they were completely baffled because Scotland Yard had not told the local cops what was going on. So that's just one example of the kind of farcical nature of this cat and mouse game that the police and the family were having to play with the brothers. Eventually, the brothers were identified as the kidnappers through their car number plate, so they were a bit careless in the way they were driving around. They were arrested. They were eventually charged with Muriel's kidnap and murder, and a few months later were put on trial at the Old Bailey, denied everything, but were convicted and jailed for murder. And it was one of the first murder trials prosecuted without a body.
So they had, or somebody had killed Muriel. What happened to Muriel at the farmhouse?
Well, until the last couple of years, through the persistence of Muriel's family, nobody knew what had happened to Muriel. One of the rumours at the time was that her body had been chopped up and fed to pigs. Now, the family have asked the killer, Nizam Hussain, was that true? And Nizam's attitude, and I was there when he said it, said, no, we didn't have pigs on the farm. We're Muslims. We wouldn't have had pigs. We had cows, and cows are vegetarian. So he was absolutely adamant that that's not what had happened to her. So until Nizam was persuaded by the family and their lawyer in Trinidad, a man called Matthew Gale, the family engaged Mr. Gale, Matthew Gale, to go and talk to Nizam Hussain. He was eventually coaxed into admitting that he had been part of the kidnap plot. And when he was asked what had happened to Muriel, whose body was never found, he said, we didn't kill her. She died, not of natural causes, but he said she collapsed one day. She was watching TV with the brothers, and on the news was an appeal by her family talking about what had happened to Muriel, asking for the public's help. And at that point, according to Nizam, Muriel suddenly collapsed and died. And in his panic, he and his brother carried her body out of the back of the farmhouse and buried her not far from there behind one of the barns. And that was the story that he has stuck to over the past 2 years.
The kidnap took place in the winter of 1969. So I suppose your involvement going to Trinidad and watching these extraordinary scenes of Diane, Muriel's daughter, hugging the killer, or certainly the person, even if he didn't kill her, certainly the person who kidnapped Muriel, must have been really extraordinary. And I'm guessing, Martin, it was driven by some sense of the family needing to find the remains and give Muriel some kind of peace and resting place, and themselves, that word that I'm never very keen on, but closure.
For all the trauma that the family suffered, there must have come a point when they had really given up any hope of ever finding what happened to Muriel. And it was only when Nizam popped up on a documentary 3 years ago that they suddenly realised that he was there, still alive, and surely was the only person who could possibly tell them what had happened. Now, in the documentary, he was still denying any role in Muriel's kidnap and murder. So they had a big task ahead of them. So it's at that point that the family hired Matthew Gale, a local lawyer in Trinidad, and got him to make contact with Nizam. And gradually he won Nizam's confidence and persuaded him to tell the truth. And Nizam suddenly began to explain what had happened to Muriel. And his rationale for doing so was that he wasn't very well, he was getting old, and before he went to meet his maker, he wanted to atone for what he did, and he wanted to give the family the closure of knowing what had happened to Muriel. And the family felt, well, if we can persuade him to tell us exactly where she is, we can go and retrieve her. It wouldn't be easy, but surely there's a way of locating the spot. We can retrieve her remains and give her the decent burial that she was deprived of during her kidnap and murder.
And they also spoke to Nizam by video call, didn't they? What happened on that video call?
I remember arranging a video call between Diane, Muriel's daughter, and Nizam in Trinidad. I was at Diane's home in Spain, and it was extraordinary. I mean, thank goodness for modern technology. The idea that Diane could re-engage with her mother's killer was a startling thing. The family had had telephone conversations with Nizam at the time of the kidnapping during the negotiation for the £1 million ransom to be paid. But all these years on, to see the moment that Diane engaged in a live video call with her mother's killer was extraordinary. And it was weirdly emotional. And Diane seemed genuinely pleased to be talking to Nizam. A year or so ago, I went with the family, with Muriel's daughter, Diane, and her son, Mark Dyer, Muriel's grandson. We went to Trinidad to meet the killer. Now, what an extraordinary moment that was. I mean, it was extraordinary for me to meet him, but watching Diane McKay and her son, Mark, greet Nizam in a very emotional way. I mean, Diane hugged him and said, "I've come all this way to see you. It's me, Diane McKay." And I couldn't quite understand it, but Diane explained it soon after by saying, we need him to tell us what happened to my mother. And I have shut off the idea that I'm talking today to the 20-year-old young idiot who killed my mother. I'm talking to a benign old man who holds the secret to what happened. That's how I rationalise it. And if people find it odd that I'm greeting him in that way, that's why I'm doing it. It's because he is the only person still alive, and who knows for how much longer, who really knows what happened to Muriel. And the family know that, he's the key to unlocking this mystery.
I can't imagine, Martin, what it was like for the family coming face to face with Muriel's killer for help. So to understand the story from their perspective and the importance of trying to recover Muriel's remains, we're joined by Mark Dyer, Muriel's grandson. Mark, thanks so much for coming to talk to us. Martin tells me that you were just 6 when your grandmother was abducted, but he says that you have memories of her. Will you share some of those with us?
Sure. I mean, at 6 years old, you remember your grandparents. You have nicknames for them, which I did. And, they were very important people to me, and she was too. We were just told, unfortunately, that after Christmas that she'd got ill and she wasn't coming back. And that was it. So eventually we were told the truth. Funnily enough, not by the family. We were told the truth by children at our schools, which was unfortunate.
How old were you when you did learn the truth that she'd been kidnapped and had disappeared?
I probably was about 18 months later. I didn't really understand what kidnap was, but people told me horrible things happened to us and to my grandmother, and that sat inside my head. And then the detail eventually came to me from other people in my early years. And, you never really forget anything like that, because unfortunately the case was so public. it just kept compounding and compounding. I could see my mother became sicker and sicker over the years. She completely became introverted, and she wasn't interested in the marriage of my father, and all those things happen. It's easy to feel sorry for yourself in these things, but I observed all these things happening, and so it's interesting how these things affect people.
And is it, Mark, when you got into adulthood and you understood what had happened a lot more, that you looked back and realised that perhaps some of those things in your childhood were due to the fact that this dreadful story had happened to your family?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's so many people who have trauma who listen to this will, they all have, there's so many traumas in different families. I think this trauma was different. It wasn't a health trauma. It was something that was just so obscure and so out of left field. There wasn't anyone else to relate to on it. So it wasn't like you could go and speak to somebody else. My mother couldn't talk to anybody else who had their mother kidnapped. Not in Europe or England or maybe in Italy. And it wasn't something that was done. And so to suddenly have someone there at Christmas and go to the dentist and what she did that day and then disappear was just obscure and traumatized everybody. And the consequences of that for so many different people in the family were horrendous.
Can you talk us through the video call with the murderer?
Yeah.
Nizam, we've all got to call him. What was that like? How difficult was it to speak to someone who'd killed your grandmother?
I guess initially I thought that this is crazy, this isn't happening. And then I realised I wanted it to happen. I wanted the answers. And so there was a feeling of victory in me, elation almost, as though I actually was getting what I wanted. And I was getting the answers that no one else had actually managed to get. Everyone had said was impossible.
Because at that time, when you started speaking to him, up until that point, he'd still denied everything. Even in a documentary 3 years ago, he still maintained that he'd had nothing to do with your grandmother's murder, and yet you moved things on a huge way and got a confession out of him.
Yeah, I think that he always wanted to confess. I just think it was the way he was approached, and I just think we were lucky to have Matthew Gale on board.
He was the lawyer you hired in Trinidad.
Yeah, and I think that Matthew was just so definite with him, and he bonded with Matthew. He quite enjoyed the friendship that he'd struck up with him and all that kind of chumminess. And I think Nizam always wanted to tell the truth. He did in 1970. He was told not to by his counsel. He said, I could get off for 95% of the things I've done if I told you the story I'm going to tell you. And he didn't tell that story stupidly. And it would have stopped all this 54 years of madness if he had.
So what was the story that he was harbouring, and what were the details that he should have revealed?
It's easy for a lot of people to be critical and say he won't have told the truth. But I can tell you, he had no reason to lie, because he had an enormous reward to tell the truth and his own lawyer representing him with a settlement agreement. And the first amount of money was, I'll tell you now, $500 American dollars, US dollars. It was put on his kitchen table, if you can call it a kitchen table, and it was pushed off the table. And this man is beyond penniless. And he said, this is not about money. This is about closure. I need to clear the decks. I need to tell what I did. I need to give you answers.
What did he actually do?
Well, he just started giving details of what happened that night. I mean, Matthew was pushing him hard and pushing him very hard in many respects. I think the police said he was shaken down by Matthew, but I think there was a bit more, they're both Trinidadian, so they both had that relationship. And I think that Nizam just said, look, I'll tell you what I did, what happened, and that I didn't kill her. She died. And I think that was the most important part for us, that he didn't kill her. And he says that so many times, I didn't kill her. And I believe him, because if you think the kidnap, which he got roped into, which he was quite a big part of, I mean, he did quite a lot. He did lots of phone calls. And I think that they definitely needed her alive in order to get any of the money. So that makes sense. And they did give her this drug. And they had the assistance of this nurse, who was press ganged by Nizam and his older brother. It was Nizam's girlfriend, and she was an NHS nurse. She was press ganged into giving this medicine. I don't know if she knew what it was for initially, but she sure did on New Year's Day 1970, because she phoned the house from the pub, and they were very drunk in there, and she said, Mrs. McKay's dead. And that is, a phone call that my mother picked up. So, all of this adds up to this drug that they gave her, Lagactigil, and he talks about Lagactigil quite freely. And that's a very strong tranquilizer. And, of course, if you're going to take someone prisoner, you've got to keep them quiet, or they're going to run away.
But by saying that she died of a heart attack or collapsed through something, that paints him in a much better light than admitting that they strangled her or stabbed her.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And I guess for him to say to me, I strangled your grandmother, or I bashed her over the head, or I incapacitated her in some other way, would have been unacceptable for me to listen to. So maybe he sugar-coated it. And I've said it to him in front of you, Martin. I said, you're sugar-coating this. No, I'm not sure. I'm telling you the truth. Well, that's something we'll never know, because that's only in his head what happened. But we've sure come a long way from what we didn't know, what we do know, and you can dissect things he says, and you can work out what is sugar-coating and what is real. And what is real is he keeps pointing, she's at the farm. Now, he maintains that, and he still can't understand why we haven't found her. He can't understand why she wasn't found in 1970. He said he kept expecting them to find her, and he kept expecting them when he was in prison for them to find her. So he was under strict instructions from his brothers, never ever to reveal anything. And remember, he was a 20-year-old man. I don't feel any sorry for him, but I'm having to do business with him, so I need to know. And he says that she's at that farm, and why would he need to lie? Didn't take the money, doesn't want the reward. People say, he wants to come to England for the National Health Service, and because he's not, he's an old man, he wants to be looked after. Well, I was privy to one meeting where he collapsed in a fit, some sort of stress fit, and within 3 minutes, an ambulance arrived. I'd like to see that happen in London. So I think the health service is pretty good in Trinidad.
Whatever the truth is, and whatever happened, and whatever Nizam's involvement was, obviously you can't bring Muriel back. But how important is it for your family that you find her remains and presumably give her a proper burial? And I hate the word closure, but I'm guessing that's probably what the family are looking for, Mark.
Look, this mystery has destroyed so many people's lives, because it's led to so many conspiracy theories and stories around it that sometimes grow ears and legs and people believe. And, the pig theory has been the most awful one, and that was spread around early on in 1970 by a journalist who had read it. It was a paper in America that someone had been fed to pigs. In fact, the Husseins were not keepers of pigs. They're Muslims. So it's a bit of a red herring.
I suppose whatever the truth is, whether Muriel was murdered or died, you know as a family that you're not going to bring her back. But how important is it for you that you find her remains and that she has a proper burial and that you have some form of closure, Mark?
I think it's absolutely essential. I think that my mother Diane, her brother Ian, and Jenny, her sister, have spent 54 years every Christmas looking at a wall thinking, where is their mother? Not celebrating Christmas. Okay, that's awful, but in reality, they've all lived in Never Never Land. And if she is at that farm, why not pick her up? Why not give her to us? It just seems that every effort we make, they put another jump, a hurdle in front of us. And really, the initial search in 2022, there should have been a police warrant, and the kidnapper, who I wanted to bring to England, should have been brought to the site. He's the perpetrator. He says he put her there. He should have been standing there. Everywhere should have been dug up, and it would have been over. We would have known yes or no. In fact, we've been left in a much worse place than Never Never Land. We're now in a much worse position than we were in 2021 when we first had the disclosure from him, because we have had 2 abortive digs carried out in an amateurish, unhelpful way, and none of our information has been thoroughly used, i.e. our connection with my grandmother's murderer, kidnapper, which for most people listening to this will seem unbelievable. But sometimes you have to do business with people you don't want to do business with in order to achieve your objective. And this is the attitude we've taken. He's the only one left alive, the only one out of that gang, and he wants to come clean. I've spoken to people who practice the same faith as he does, even imams, and they've confirmed what he's trying to do. He's trying to settle all the scores before he passes to the next world. I think it's quite a nice thing to do. I think if he's been involved in these dreadful things, give him a chance to do that. Why not?
In addition to co-hosting True Criminals, Helen hosts her own award-winning podcast, The Convex Conversation. If you're eager to learn more about the inspiring guests she interviews, from royalty to astronauts, from industry leaders to explorers, check it out at convex.podbean.com or search The Convex Conversation on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to yours.
And if you're curious to dive deeper into Martin's work as a crime reporter, I had the pleasure of interviewing him about his book, No One Got Cracked Over the Head for No Reason, Dispatches from a Crime Reporter, on my podcast. In this episode, Martin shares some gripping stories that resonate with the themes we explore here on True Criminals. You can find links to that episode in our show notes or on the True Criminals page at audiobleachglobal.com.
Mark, you and I visited the farm where your grandmother was held and murdered last year. We walked a circuitous route through footpaths for about 20 minutes. And it was only when we were walking up that you told me you'd never been there before. I was astonished.
Yeah.
I guess my fault. I'd never asked you about it. What was it like to make that first visit?
Well, Rook's Farm was always described to me from the age of 8 years old, when eventually I did find out what happened, as a place you're never to go to. And that village, Stocking Pelham, was somewhere that didn't exist and we were never to go near and never visit. And to be honest, those words sort of echoed in my ears. And I think it was my mother had to make it Diane somewhere, so horrific to us that, we would be frightened to go there. And I think that was probably a narrative that works when you're bringing up children. But to go there with you, I thought it was a really positive move. I felt good about it. I felt good because I knew I was the second member. Diane had already been there, of the family. And I remember Diane had walked down the path past the kitchen, because there's that footpath where her mother's, last moments took place. When she arrived, I don't know what state she arrived in. When she left dead. Where did she go? Well, according to Nizam, through that archway. She was buried somewhere around the muck heap. And, for him to be allowed there seems the only way of ending the story. Sadly, we were told on no account was he coming, were they going to entertain it, even though they weren't going to have to pay for it, or pay for his accommodation. That had been kindly, the Sun newspaper had decided they would provide all that. Alex's old paper.
The police attitude is that they went to interview Nizam in Trinidad and he was vague, inconsistent with where he said he buried Muriel. That was their reason for saying there was no point in bringing him back to the farm.
Well, that's bonkers, because if you buried someone in panic 54 years previously, and you've done something so terrible, you know the muck heap, you know exactly where, you can imagine, the dreams he's had every night since he was arrested. And I think if he's alive, bring him there. Yes, the police went to Nizam Hussein's house, his family home, which they've owned, I think, the family, his father, parents owned it. You've been there, Martin. And they arrested him with the local police. I mean, it's completely ridiculous. We dealt with this in a very sensitive way. We had him approached in a sensitive way. We even brought him to the Hyatt Hotel. We had him, put him in there for 3 days. He smokes too much wacky-backy. We made sure the people in the ground made sure he couldn't get any of that. And so when you met him with me and Diane, he was completely normal and sanguine. And like any of us around this table, he was talking quite emotively and without... I thought he was pretty genuine. I don't know what you thought, Martin, but I think you were shocked.
I was very impressed. It was compelling. As when we came back, we showed our recorded interview, you talking to Nizam. We showed it to the lead investigator at Scotland Yard, and she used that word. She said it was compelling. And that prompted her and her colleagues to then go themselves to Trinidad and interview him.
That in itself was the weakness, because I said to the lady, the chief investigating officer, I said to her, look, and Diane said very poignantly, said, you mustn't go on your own because we have spent 3 years creating a relationship. Remember, this man's been hiding this information for 51 years. He spent 21 years in jail. He is a shambles and his mental state is shambolic. But he was very compos mentis and clear with me for the whole of that Saturday and some of the Sunday next. And therefore, I must go with you, although I don't want to. Diane said, I'll go with you. I'll set it up the way I set it up before. We'll go and see him. He would have spent 2 days cooling down in the hotel. And we'll go and see him in the air-conditioned meeting room. And I will introduce you to him. Because once he's with my mother, he's an absolute putty. It's as though he's spent 54 years thinking about her, what he did. Remember, he saw her on television, appealing for her mother's life. He saw her, he had telephone calls with her, and then he could see her on television, and he suddenly realised there was this nice young woman who he probably quite liked the look of, who was more his age, who was talking to him nicely. He probably thought, my God, what have I done? What have I done? And then he was calling her and he knew she was dead. You know, he must have some heart in him somewhere. And I'm sure, I know what he said to me. He said, I regret everything I've done and I've had a terrible life because of it. And he's even told the Trinidadian press, he said, young people, don't ever take anything, don't ever do what I did. I wrecked my life and everybody else's. So if you can't believe this is a man trying to come clean, if you can't give him that, if he's lying, it's a bizarre thing to do because he could have had the money and lied. And he didn't need to be so honest and emotive with us.
Is the difficulty, Mark, that when you went to see him and Martin was there in Trinidad, I'm guessing you had maps of the farm, but the farm's probably changed in those 54 years. And is that why it's important to try and get him over?
Look, we had maps of the farm, how it was then, to be fair, but they were aerial maps and they were slightly wishy-washy, but he did point to the manure heap, whether it was a manure heap behind that fence or that fence. It's difficult, you know, when you're put on the spot. And remember, he was sitting there holding hands with my mother, which between me and my mother, and he was shaking, and I didn't think he was going to tell us. And then he just said, okay, I'll tell you. It's somewhere here, behind the fence, 3-4 foot, under the manure heap, here. He was pointing in an area, but we said, is it here? I think around here. Now remember, this is 54 years. Whether he'd ever been in a helicopter over that farm, I don't think so. Or whether there was Google Maps in those days, I don't think so. So let's just remember, we have all those things. We have Google Maps now. We can see things from the sky. So he's working out somebody who can't actually quite calibrate where he is. But he's in the neighbourhood. He's in the neck of the woods.
He was quite precise when we were talking to him in Trinidad. He said 3 feet from the fence.
Yes.
That's where the body is. So when the police searched for the second time in July, not that long ago, why didn't they find her?
Well, it's a very good question. And there were a number of fences, whether he's pointing at the right fence. I am suspicious of how he located exactly there, because the night before he did this appeal to claimant, he was shown some commander claimant. He was given some pictures which we'd had particularly well recovered of the entrance between the two barns. And as you go through those barns, you go past what's now the stable block, and there's a little hill up to the horse exercise area. And he said, this is where I went through. Did he go right or did he go left? I don't know. But if he's talking about the muck heap, we don't know. We've never been involved. So all this information comes from us. And yet, bless them, the police have never involved us in from the beginning in any of the digs. So we've been excluded, poignantly excluded, my mother as well, from being there, and the kidnapper. So you would think if you're going to sort something out of this magnitude, you'd just say, right, I need everyone. Let's get the family there. Let's get the kidnapper there. They're all talking. Let's have everyone there. And by the way, let's have a bloody great wall chart with a whiteboard of each inch that we've searched. There was nothing like that. There was no whiteboard. There was no ops room showing what we're digging, where we're doing, what we've dug up. All I know is that there are amazing scanning machines. We've been going on about this since 21. Why they haven't been used, why there hasn't been a warrant, why the family haven't been involved from day one, why has the kidnapper been discounted? Very odd, really. If you're into conspiracy theories, they grow. Because if you're going to have a solution to something, you've got the kidnapper saying, I'll show you where she is. You've got us saying, he's told us about where she is. He's pointed at some maps. Martin's right. We searched that area, but maybe it's to the left of that, to the right of that. And why isn't there the latest scanning machines? Far be for me to criticise, but I have never done a dig on my life, and I've seen them on TV. They look pretty good on TV in the cop shows, but we didn't get that. We got a very amateurish dig done twice, and it's a shame because we would like to have been involved.
Mark, 2 digs. They haven't found your grandmother. Scotland Yard said they're not going to go back and do another dig. The farm owner won't allow another dig. What more can you do?
Okay, so I'll address that. So Scotland Yard actually said unless more information comes to light. And I don't know how much more information to come to light apart from the perpetrator saying she's there and he's continuing to say she's there. So really Scotland Yard needs to supply a plan of everything that they've dug, every inch. We now sadly were told when we got there on that Sunday, and I was pretty pissed off. I decided to walk out to the dig area. Maybe it was a gift. I walked out there and saw this other area flagged off, and I said, well, what's going on here? This is the 2022 area. Well, the Dutch lady, she said, well, I found out they haven't dug a lot of it. And there was a kind of huddle. They sort of hushed me away. I think Scotland Yard, they've made their point, but I think when they supply the evidence of both the digs, there will be holes in it. And I think they will be compelled to go back there with a warrant and finish this with the perpetrator, because it's too embarrassing for them not to do it properly. And you know what? 3rd time lucky, maybe.
How much would it mean to you and your mum, Diane, and the rest of the family to find Muriel and lay her to rest?
I think I'm going to reverse that question on you. Just imagine if that had happened to your mother. I think, or even your grandma, because it would traumatise you through your mother. I think you would want to know that she's out of there. You know, she'd just come back from the dentist. She'd just taken Mrs. Nightingale home, who used to help her cleaning that house in Arthur Road. She drove in the driveway. Nizam says they pulled in the driveway after her. So that now explains why there was no sign of any break-in, which is, he told us that. So we've been wondering for years how they got into the house, because the chain was off the door. You know, the fact is that she was outside, not inside. So, you know, that's something my mother's been wanting to know for years. And I showed Nizam this picture just to show you how honest, not honest, but how I know that things he is saying relate to the truth. There was a dog in the house called Carly, and in fact, I'll relate. My mum was Muriel's nickname. Mum Carly was her nickname. She was named after a dog. I was a kid. Anyway, I have an old cine film of Carly in that house, and it was on my WhatsApp. So that after 10 minutes seeing with Nizam, I said, look, I know, Nizam, you're into dogs. And he said, yeah. I said, you had some dogs at the farm, Ronnie and Reggie, the black Alsatians. I said, they didn't hurt my grandmother, did they? And he suddenly perked up and said, no, this is not me. I said, that reassures me. I said, can I show you a video of a dog? He said, yeah. I saw the video, I pulled out my phone. And he said, I know this dog. This dog's in Wimbledon. This dog was in the house. I said, yeah, that's Carly. I know this dog. So, that, my mother looked at me and went, Diana looked at me and she said, God, he is telling the truth. So that, the little tests we gave him, we pushed him harder and harder for more things. I pushed him for detail, unpleasant detail. What I got was he actually said he was like a guard. He sat outside this room they kept a prisoner in. She was drugged up. They kept her in there, and obviously they made her write messages, but he had to make sure she never left that room. And that kind of resonates with how you would keep someone prisoner. They're ghastly details, but actually, is it better knowing them? Yeah, it is, because it's taken away some of the what happened, and it's given us answers. To find her would be the icing on the cake. And look, if she's at that farm, she's somewhere buried behind one of those barns. And why we haven't been able to really do a proper dig is because Ian obviously loves his house and doesn't want it messed up, and I get it.
This is Ian Marsh, the farm owner.
I quite like Ian. He's a normal bloke. He's got some lovely horses. But he did buy a house. He didn't look at the CPSEs on, because he's bought a house with a history.
Mark, you seem to be suggesting that Scotland Yard haven't done a proper investigation. They've been half-hearted, not really bothered about finding your grandmother. But surely, for that team of detectives, it would be a huge accolade if after 55 years they did find her. So why do you think they're not?
Well, that's another
really
interesting
keen?
question. And that's, you're right, it would be a huge accolade. The chief superintendent, I think a detective superintendent, she wrote a letter to me saying we would welcome Nizam Hussain at the farm during the dig. The only reason I didn't bring him to the farm was I was warned that I could be walking into a trap, whereby I ended up being arrested for bringing a deported murderer, my grandmother's kidnapper. Wouldn't that have been ridiculous? And my mother would have been charged with bringing someone to the country. So we decided we would do things and play things properly and do it properly. So we said, look, go and ask the Home Office. In fact, it was the Sun newspaper that went to see the Home Office, and the Home Office said, look, we'll let him in as long as the police ask. That was the narrative, the middle of that week. So we were delighted. Thank you very much, Sun newspaper. So the road was clear to bring him in. So what more? Let's let him in. So all they needed to do was just phone up the Home Office and say, he's coming in, BA from Trinidad. We knew there wasn't a stop on him, but, he's coming in anyway. He's our chap. Look after him when he arrives. And it's a short drive from Gatwick along the M25, M23, M25, eventually to the farm. And he could have had a night's sleep and then come in the next day fresh and walked around with Matthew. And that would have really, with all the plans of, and because the land is actually, as he said to us in Trinidad, he said, I'll understand. I remember saying that, I'll understand how the land lies. And it does lie exactly the same as it did. It's got that little slope up to his horse exercise yard. So it made sense for them to say to Ian, it's his mum, to me, actually, it's not costing us anything. Let's knock this on the head, because if we've allowed him in the country, we take him to the farm, there's nothing more we can do, and we don't find her. We may be doing another week or two of digging, but Ian didn't mind. Ian would rather have it resolved, Ian being the property owner, than in another week or two of digging. There was no skin off his nose. And, he was using the other side of his property, and he was quite good-humoured about it in the end. So I think it was churlish of them, and a poor decision. And I said to them, who's making this decision? And I said, who are the board here? Who are the directors? Who is in charge? We are. Well, who's we? Well, me and some others. I said, well, can we have a chat with those people who are making the decision, which is wrong? because where we are now is it's never going to end. You're going to walk away from here and we're going to continue. Why are you doing this? We can end it now in the next 24 hours. And I think that was a real missed opportunity for the police and for us. And look, let's just say the police have no idea. They've not done this sort of thing before. They mentioned that they'd never in their history, and I'm not sure if this is true, Martin, they said they'd never in their history of Scotland Yard, they'd been into their history, had a guy who'd done life in prison come out and said he wants to say where the body is. Okay, so that's a first. But remember, this case, as I said to them, had so many firsts. This is the first kidnapping for ransom ever in Britain. This is the first time anyone was sent to prison for life without a body. So why couldn't we have a first? Another first. Bring the perpetrator to the grave and saying, actually, I've got her a bit wrong on this plan. She's over there, I think. Let's go and have a look. You know, it's nonsense not to do it. And what they've done is they've left my mother, Diane, and Ian, and her sister, and the rest, I guess me, and my elder sister who knew Muriel, in Never Never Land forevermore. And I don't know what effect that also has on the other family who were affected by this. You know, obviously, you know, let's not forget Rupert Murdoch, was traumatised by this.
Well, of course, it was a kidnap of mistaken identity, wasn't it? The kidnappers thought they'd taken Rupert Murdoch's wife, Anna.
Yeah.
How has Rupert kept up to date with the situation? Has he shown an interest in the story? I know he was quite fond of Muriel, wasn't he?
Yeah, very fond of her, and he was actually incredibly close to Alec. I mean, they were kind of like, I would say, they had a sort of uncle relationship. Alec was older, but in the same business.
Your grandpa was Alec.
Yeah, and obviously he trusted Alec, who knew his father. I mean, look, you know, no doubt they had a very strong friendship in business and personally, and it would have been massively traumatising for that family too. And I think you've explained some of it to me yourself. So yeah, they've followed it. They've been incredibly helpful, and through his wonderful secretary, she has been in touch with us, you know, very regularly, and with Diane. And anything we can do to help at any time. So I guess for everybody to have this ghastly word closure, to have Muriel out of that farm, if that's where she is, or Mum as I call her, as I relate to her, I don't relate to her as Muriel, is a no-brainer. And to leave it in this ghastly, now where we are, two digs done, I'm sorry guys, half-heartedly.
And will there be a third dig? I mean, what now, Mark?
Certainly there'll be a third dig. There'll be a third and final dig, and I'm hoping that the third and final dig will be run by a team who involve the family, and it may be a dig that involves just Ian and the family, because if the police haven't got a unit who can do it professionally, then perhaps we would need to call in someone who could. But it forevermore will haunt the landowner because he knows it's unsettled business at his home. Ghastly for him, but for us, for my mother, Diane, who's been to that farm now a few times, and Ian, she actually walked up that path, and that path has always been there since the 60s, that concrete path outside the kitchen. And really, you know, when I was walking, I was thinking about what happened that night, the terror. She was driven in the cold for 2 hours with these guys who spoke in an accent she probably didn't recognise too well. And what did they say to her? What did they say to convince her that she was okay? She must have been in complete terror her last couple of days.
Mark, we wish you well the next steps of your fight, and I really, really hope that you finally do get to lay your grandmother to rest and find some peace for your mum too and the rest of the family.
Well, thank you very much for your interest. I mean, all of you and the press have been phenomenal. And I mean, without the press, we'd be nowhere. And really, it makes sense that the press is so interested. Apart from it being a press story, this was a press killing or press kidnap, which has never happened before.
Thanks for joining us, Mark.
Martin, gosh, to think back that this story first came to your attention when you're a little 14-year-old paper lad delivering your newspapers. And here we are, 55 years later, and you know the family and Mark really well, and you've been by their side as they've gone on this extraordinary journey. What struck you about this case, getting to know them and seeing it unfold, really?
It just seems extraordinary that after more than half a century that I should pick up a story that so captivated me as a schoolboy and may have played a part in eventually me doing the job I do now as a crime reporter. I mean, it was a gruesome and yet fascinating story, which you can spend ages talking about people's fascination with true crime. And, you know, I'm a shining example of it. And this story was something that captivated me. I'll tell you something else as well. To suddenly be interviewing the family after all those years and to discover that one or two members were living not far from me. And Diane McKay is a very good friend of one of my neighbours where I live. I mean, just the connections just seem extraordinary. But more than any of that, what really got me interested was the idea that after all this time, maybe I can play a tiny role in helping find Muriel's remains. And the family have been at great pains to say that without the media's help over the last 3 years, they probably wouldn't have got as far as they have in persuading Scotland Yard to do not one but two digs, excavations for Muriel's remains at the farm in Hertfordshire. They, of course, are terribly disappointed with the way it's ended, but they don't believe it's ended. They believe there is still an opportunity to pursue another search at the farm. I think the odds are against them. They see it as unfinished business, but the odds are against them. The landowner has said he doesn't want to have another search. He said this last search was the end of it. The police have said they are not going to go back to the farm. Scotland Yard's attitude is Nizam was wrong when he said, "This is where I buried her." He either wasn't telling the truth or he's an old man with a dodgy memory. So the family have got lots of hurdles to overcome, but they're a determined, resourceful family. And they've got one or two ideas about how to pursue it. They are certainly not giving up.
I think one thing that really struck me, which I would imagine throughout your career you've seen a lot of, is the impact that incident and murder and the loss of Muriel has had on the family. To sit here as a mum and hear Mark talk about him being a 6-year-old little boy and being told his grandmother had gone away, and then finding out from school children what had happened to her, and hearing the impact that it's had on all of their lives. Diane, the mum, who I'm guessing is in her 80s now, Diane's brother Ian, and also on Mark's life. But you see that side of crime a lot, don't you? The impact on victims' families.
I do, and however focused I am on covering crime stories as they unfold and the way the criminal justice system works and what happens to a police investigation where suspects are arrested and charged and go to court, and then I end up covering the trials, it's important never to forget or lose track of the victims. I mean, the victims are at the heart of all crime stories. And it would be easy to get wrapped up in the twists and turns of the investigation and what happens at court. But ultimately, crime, serious crime, violent crime, is really all about the victims. And it's sometimes easy to forget that even though victims can survive and perhaps get over the initial shock and effect, often the effect of what happened to them goes on for years and years and years.
And just to conclude, could there be potentially a third search? I know you said the landowner's not very keen, but could the family, perhaps, I sense some unhappiness with the police investigation, could they mount a private search? And do you think one day Muriel will be found?
The family could launch a private search, but they could only do that with the support and agreement of the landowner. And I think that's going to be very difficult to achieve because the landowner, Ian Marsh, said that this was the last dig, and he felt that he was bending over backwards to be accommodating. You know, he watched quite a bit of his land being dug up including a lean-to, or the floor of a lean-to barn. Promise was that it would all be restored, and I'm sure it probably has been by now. But Ian Marsh hated the idea of the media focus on his farm. And maybe if there's one thing that might persuade him to allow a third dig, is that his farm has now become so closely associated with this dreadful crime, and there was another murder at the farm some years later, that maybe he might be persuaded to get it all done once and for all. Either she's there or she's not, for the family to be satisfied that everything has been done, and for the family perhaps to accept that she isn't at the farm. Then maybe that could be enough for the landowner to say, OK, one more time.
Hey listeners, True Criminals is a new show and your support means everything to us. If you're enjoying the podcast, please take a moment to leave us a review. It helps us grow, reach new listeners, and keep bringing you the stories you love. This episode is brought to you by Audio Bleach Global. Our senior producer is Russell Barnes, with mixing by Andrew Chappell. The original score was composed by Chap Mannequin, artwork by Bleached, executive produced by Lee Mann. Follow True Criminals on Instagram at true.criminals and on YouTube at youtube.com/@true-criminals. For exclusive content and ways to support the show, visit us at patreon.com/True Criminals. For partnership opportunities, please contact us at contact@audiobleachglobal.com.